nuclear strategy and policy, and I would like to welcome and thank the expert witnesses before us today. Ms. Madeline Creedon is a research professor at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. She brings more than 30 years of senior leadership experience across the Department of Defense, the National Nuclear Security Administration, and the Senate Armed Services Committee, where she handled the Strategic Forces portfolio. Ms. Creedon currently serves as the chair of the Strategic Posture Commission, which was created in the fiscal year 2022 National Defense Authorization Act. Ms. Rose Gottemoeller is the Stephen C. Hazy Lecturer at Stanford University. She served most recently as the Deputy Secretary General of NATO and previously as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the Department of State, where she was the chief U.S. negotiator of the New START Treaty. She is also a member of the Strategic Posture Commission. Mr. Eric Edelman serves as counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments and on the board of directors of the United States Institute of Peace. He brings decades of experience at the highest levels of the Defense Department and State Department and has written extensively on arms control issues and strategic stability. Mr. Franklin Miller is the principal of the Scowcroft Group. He served for more than 30 years in the Department of Defense and the White House as an expert on nonproliferation, nuclear deterrence, and arms control policy, especially with regard to Russia. He also sits on the Strategic Posture Commission. Thank you again to our distinguished witnesses for appearing before the committee and for your decades of service to our nation. Our objective today is to discuss the rapid changes in nuclear deterrence strategy and arms control we are witnessing around the world. Successfully maintaining our nuclear deterrent is a mission fundamental to our long-term strategic competition with China and Russia. This mission has been made especially clear throughout Russia's assault on Ukraine. Russia has conducted out-of-cycle nuclear exercises, issued inflammatory statements about tactical nuclear strikes, and is essentially holding the largest nuclear power plant in Europe hostage to shield its forces. Vladimir Putin's behavior has been reckless to a very dangerous degree. More broadly, Russia has modernized much of its nuclear arsenal and is developing a suite of weapons outside the terms of the New START Treaty to threaten the United States and Europe. These weapons, such as cruise missiles, long-range torpedoes, and hypersonics, are intended to evade missile defense systems and create a destabilizing challenge. China has also made significant changes to its nuclear approach. Not constrained by the New START Treaty, Beijing has built hundreds of new ballistic missiles, and the intelligence community assesses it may have a stockpile of more than 1,000 warheads by the early 2030s. In the past 2 years, we have also seen China develop missile fields in hardened silos throughout the country. This development, along with China's development of air-delivered weapons and ballistic missile submarines in the South China Sea, fundamentally changes the nature of Beijing's nuclear doctrine. As I mentioned last week at the nomination hearing for General Cotton to be STRATCOM commander, we need to seriously consider that we are entering a new trilateral nuclear competition era. The Cold War was essentially a bilateral competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and deterrence theory and communication methods were developed based on two rivals. Those rules now must change with the ascendancy of China and its growing nuclear arsenal. I would like to know our witnesses' views on how we might balance strategic stability with both China and Russia while exploring what can be done to possibly bring both into an arms control framework. Similarly, I would like your thoughts on whether the force structure we are investing in will be able to deter future threats from our competitors. In addition to China and Russia, we must also manage the challenge posed by Iran. In the 4 years since then President Trump pulled out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, Iran has made key advances in its nuclear program. It has decreased its breakout time to several weeks from a year under the agreement, and Iran announced in July it has the technical capacity to build a nuclear weapon, including the ability to enrich uranium to 90%, which is well beyond the 4% allowed under JCPOA. Iran has also hardened its infrastructure and replaced damaged equipment with more advanced models. While an agreement to return to Iran to the JCPOA may be close, the final outcome has not yet been determined. I'm interested to know your assessment on Iran's nuclear program and whether you agree that returning Iran to the JCPOA remains in the vital national security interest of the United States. Finally, I would recall the testimony of Professor Paul Bracken from Yale, who testified before the Strategic Forces Subcommittee last year. He noted that we are now in a second nuclear age, with multiple countries and decision-makers involved, a much more complicated environment than the Cold War. Professor Bracken testified that in this second nuclear age, we'll still have to think our way through it. Indeed, I hope today's hearing will help us think about and better understand the complexities we are now facing. It is vital that we develop the force structure, policy, and arms control strategies required to overcome the challenges ahead. And I look forward to the witnesses' insights into these issues, and I thank them for their participation. And now let me recognize the ranking member, Senator Inhofe, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to welcome our witnesses and thank you all for your long service to our nation. Today we're facing greater nuclear threats than at any time since the worst days of the Cold War, threats that are expected to become even worse in the coming years. China's massive military investments, especially its stunning nuclear breakout, will reshape the global balance of power in ways that we've never seen before. Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and his pursuit of new nuclear capabilities clearly demonstrate that Russia remains a primary threat to the West. The United States has never faced two nuclear-armed peer adversaries. That's worth repeating because it's a reality. The United States has never faced two nuclear-armed peer adversaries. And it's clear to me that we're not prepared for this reality. Despite ongoing efforts to modernize our own nuclear forces, are older and less capable than they have been in the past. Our supporting infrastructure is literally crumbling. Thankfully, the Biden administration did not adopt some of the more radical options discussed during the recent nuclear posture review. However, the administration's decision to discard planned enhancements to our forces, even as China and Russia grow their arsenals, was disappointing to say the least. Based in part on the advice of numerous senior officers, we have taken bipartisan steps to reverse those faulty choices, but we have much more work to be done. Each of you represents decades of experience in nuclear issues, and I'm glad you are here to offer us your perspective on the challenges that we face and how we can best prepare our nation for dealing with dangerous futures. So I look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Inhofe. Ms. Creedon, would you begin, please?
Good morning, Chairman Reed, Senator Inhofe, and distinguished members of the committee. It's always an honor to appear before the Senate Committee on Armed Services, particularly in the company of such distinguished panelists. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss the future of U.S. strategic relationships with Russia and China, the U.S. nuclear modernization programs, how these programs will enable the United States to meet future deterrence requirements, the future of arms control post-New START, and how China's rise can be taken into consideration in future arms control agreements. These are important, complex topics that should be discussed more openly and more frequently. So to start, I want to be clear today that I share with you my own personal thoughts and do not represent or speak on behalf of any organization or entity. The world today is a more dangerous, more chaotic, and more uncertain place than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Russian President Putin's distorted version of Russian history and his aggressive, unprovoked attack on Ukraine has resulted in a previously unthinkable land war in Europe. The United States now finds itself, for the first time, in what can only be described as a three-peer or near-peer multipolar environment, complicated by North Korea. Overlay the regional competition of India and Pakistan, their nuclear arsenals, and their respective complex relationships with Russia and China, and the chance of nuclear use is high. The doomsday clock tool is now set at 100 seconds to midnight. In contrast, in 1991, at the end of the Cold War, the clock setting was 17 minutes to midnight. Russia and China engaged in significant military modernization over the last 15 years, and both have expanded dramatically the size and variety of their conventional capabilities and nuclear arsenals. China has been focused on growing and improving its conventional space and cyber capabilities, including the recent test of a fractional orbital bombardment system that ended with a hypersonic glide vehicle impacting a target in China. China is amid a surprisingly rapid expansion of its nuclear capabilities, including a true nuclear triad. China has thousands of missiles of all ranges and is expanding its dual-use capabilities. Although estimates vary, China is projected to have somewhere between 1,000, 1,200, or maybe even more nuclear weapons by 2030. Russia has developed a wide range of non-strategic, dual-capable, and novel nuclear systems, in addition to the mostly complete modernization of its strategic nuclear forces, including the Sarmat, a new MIRV ICBM, and a new ballistic missile submarine. Russia also has invested substantial sums modernizing its conventional and non-kinetic systems, as well as its cyber, space, and counterspace weapons. Recall that Russia tested a kinetic ASAT weapon in November of last year, generating thousands of pieces of space debris and possibly even putting the International Space Station at risk. And of course, for all its conventional modernization, we've seen its fairly dismal performance in Ukraine. North Korea is also increasing its nuclear saber-rattling via a new policy, reinforcing its commitment to never give up nuclear weapons, clearly stating its preemptive nuclear use policy and declaring that nuclear weapons would be used if the regime leadership were threatened. This nuclear policy law is yet another DPRK mechanism to seek acceptance and recognition of its status as a nuclear weapon state permanently. Against this most troubling and dangerous picture, there are 6 things to keep in mind. First, to maintain a capable, credible, safe, secure, and reliable U.S. nuclear deterrent, the ongoing nuclear modernization program, which is replacing all 3 legs of the triad, air, sea, and land, plus the nuclear command and control system, as well as other supporting systems, must be fully funded, including taking into account inflation, as there is little to no margin in any of these programs. Maintaining the current systems until the new systems come online is essential. The current systems are past their lifetimes, have already been life extended, such as the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine, and the new programs will most likely be late, and the handoff from old to new will be difficult. 3, the infrastructure across the entire complex is mostly old but being replaced. The NNSA complex needs new or expanding manufacturing and material processing and handling capabilities, such as plutonium pits, uranium processing, lithium, tritium, and electronics. The DoD complex also needs new and expanded infrastructure. People. People's number 4, and probably the most important. Recruiting and retaining people at all skill and technical levels is essential, and just about every aspect of the nuclear complex is struggling. 5, we have to ensure that the future systems are modular and adaptable because they will be in the inventory for decades and must meet future threats. And finally, don't give up on arms control. Strategic stability, transparency initiatives, setting norms, building relationships where possible, and maintaining nonproliferation and threat reduction programs. A whole-of-government approach is needed to find the new ways to reduce tensions and prevent an all-out arms race, which is unaffordable and hopefully something no one wants. With these 6 ideas, I conclude my remarks and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Gottemoeller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to you, to Ranking Member Mr. Inhofe, and to the distinguished members of the committee. I'm delighted to be here today. It's very much my honor to appear. You have asked me to comment on the future of arms control, in particular my role on arms control agreements in the context of a possible New START treaty follow-on, as well as how China's rise will be taken into account for any future arms control agreements beyond New START. I'm pleased to do so, but I do want to underscore that I agree with my colleague, Madeleine Creedon, in each of the 6 points that she has just laid out. I think they are an excellent roadmap for how we need to proceed, and I particularly underscore her emphasis on all the necessary points with regard to nuclear modernization. So I'm going to abbreviate my prepared remarks in the interest of time, but I do ask that they be placed on the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. Now, turning to my points, I wanted to note that while the Russians are continuing to comply with the New START treaty, the central limits of which is 1,550 warheads and 700 delivery vehicles, that is, the missiles and bombers on which they are deployed, then this will be a significant advantage to the success of the U.S. nuclear modernization. Of course, we must watch carefully for any sign of Russian noncompliance with the treaty. If they continue to comply, the treaty gives the United States a significant level of predictability about the size and composition of the Russian strategic nuclear forces. Therefore, we will enjoy a somewhat stable and predictable environment in which to carry out our own nuclear modernization. And I repeat, it is an urgently needed one. I underscore every point that Madeleine Creedon has made in that regard. My concern is rooted in the fact that the Russian Federation has been embarked on a nuclear modernization for over a decade. They have hot production lines for both their missiles and their warheads. In my view, if suddenly released from New START limits, they could easily outrun us in missiles and warhead production, because we are just at the beginning of rebuilding our own missile and warhead production capacity. This fact is the important reason to seek a follow-on to the New START treaty, which expires in February 2026. At that time, we will still be rebuilding our production capacity and be in the midst of our nuclear modernization program. A predictable and stable nuclear environment with the Russians will continue to be vital to its success. As for the Chinese, like others, I am greatly concerned about their nuclear modernization and the opacity with which they are conducting it. They clearly seem to be moving away from their dependence on second strike retaliation as a core tenet of their nuclear doctrine. However, we do not yet know exactly where they are planning to go. Are they rushing to parity with the United States, or is something else afoot? Our most important objective with the Chinese must be to influence that direction of travel. Therefore, we should engage as early and as frequently as we can in talks both to clear up the opacity surrounding their nuclear forces and to convince them of the value of nuclear restraint. To be honest, I am confident that we can respond, if we must, to a Chinese nuclear buildup. The competition that concerns me more is in the arena of high technology, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and other areas. If the Chinese outrun us in that arena, then we will be left in the dust, I am concerned, in the coming decade. In sum, the United States should not be the one to launch a nuclear arms race, but it must be ready to respond to others who do. This point relates not only to the continued strength and viability of our nuclear deterrent, but also to our ability to compete successfully in technology and innovation in the century to come. The last thing that the United States needs, as it is trying to prevail in new technologies, is a nuclear arms race. One final point, Mr. Chairman, that does not appear in my testimony. I am horrified this morning at the news of Russia's dangerous strike at the nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine, but I'm not surprised. They have been writing of such targets in their military journals for years. But this matter gets at the question of how can we negotiate with such people? My answer comes down to the point that we can't always choose our negotiating partners. We must look to our own national security interest. In my view, it is squarely in the national security interest of the United States to negotiate constraints and restraints on nuclear weapons, and we should continue to do so, both with the Russians and now in future with the Chinese. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me now recognize Ambassador Edelman.
Thank you, Chairman Reed and Ranking Member Inhofe, members of the committee. I very much appreciate the invitation to appear before you today on this distinguished panel to talk about the challenges that the United States faces in continuing to deter nuclear war and preserving the tradition of non-use of nuclear weapons that has prevailed globally since 1945. In deference to time and the fact that my colleagues and you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Inhofe have already addressed many of the challenges that we face that are addressed in the joint statement that my colleague Frank Miller and I submitted to the committee. I would ask that you include that in the permanent record of the hearing. And I'm just going to limit my comments really to emphasizing one of our preliminary conclusions that Frank and I reached that echoes very much what my colleague on this panel, Madeleine Creedon, has said, which is the importance of moving forward with the modernization of our nuclear triad. This is something that the Senate, in its wisdom, when it ratified the New START Treaty in 2010, called for. And it is even more important today in light of the facts, Mr. Chairman, that you and Senator Inhofe and my two predecessors on this panel have adverted to. I would like to make the point that we frequently hear that the modernization of U.S. nuclear forces is either triggering or is participating in an arms race, with the notion that it's an action-reaction parallel effort on both sides, and that U.S. efforts to modernize will only make things worse. In fact, the historical record, I think, is pretty clear that although there were elements of arms racing in the arms competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, by and large, other factors on both sides drove the development of the nuclear forces that each side developed. And rather than the sort of image of apes on a treadmill that is sometimes used to depict that, I think former Secretary of Defense, the late Harold Brown, in the Carter administration, captured it best when he said, when we build, the Soviets build. When we stop building, they keep building. And I think that very much describes the situation we find ourselves in today. The United States has actually been quite slow to modernize its nuclear triad. We've only really begun in earnest in the last few years in the face of this very, very dramatic buildup that we've seen on the other sides. And it's absolutely imperative, in order to sustain deterrence, that we maintain a force that's flexible, survivable, responsive, and has the range. And today, as Madeline suggested, our margin for error, because we have essentially one program to modernize each element of our triad, as opposed to the multiple programs that our adversaries are fielding for different elements of their triad, we have very, very little margin for error. So with that, I would conclude my oral comments, and I look forward very much to engaging with you and the other members of the committee.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Miller, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reed and Ranking Member Inhofe and its members of this committee. It's a pleasure and an honor to appear before you again. And I should say that the views I'm expressing this morning are my own, and they don't represent those of any organization with which I am affiliated. As you've noted, sirs, we are in a unique and unprecedented time. We need to deter two nuclear peer potential enemies. And Professor Bracken notwithstanding, and I testified alongside him at that hearing, we do know how deterrence works. The United States needs to hold at risk what potential enemy leaders value most. Often we are tempted to assume Xi and Putin think as we do. But as the Scowcroft Commission noted almost 40 years ago, and I quote, "Deterrence is not and cannot be bluff. In order for deterrence to be effective, we must not merely have weapons, we must be perceived to be able and prepared, if necessary, to use them effectively against the key elements of an enemy's power. Deterrence is not an abstract notion amenable to simple quantification. Still less is it a mirror of what would deter ourselves. Deterrence is the set of beliefs in the minds of the enemy leaders, given their own values and attitudes about our capabilities and our will. It requires us to determine as best we can what would deter them from considering aggression, even in a crisis, not to determine what would deter us," end quote. Ambassador Edelman and I have stated in our written submission that we believe the United States needs to be able to deter both China and Russia simultaneously. Dictators can agree secretly to support one another and spring that on an unknowing world at short notice. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 is the prime example. This is something we cannot ignore in our planning, even if we believe the event is unlikely. The forces we currently deploy under the New START Treaty will not be adequate for this dual deterrence task. The 1550 weapons limit was agreed to in 2010, a period in time when Russia was a competitor, not a potential enemy, ravaging another European state and threatening to use nuclear weapons on the battlefield, and China was not even a real part of the discussion. As the Commission knows full well, the world is very different now. Our goal must be a secure and effective deterrent which is sized appropriately for the two nuclear peer task. There is no replacement for such a capability. Arms control treaties, if they provide for a secure and effective deterrent, can help mitigate arms competition, but only if those treaties are observed. They are not a substitute, however, for the deterrent. And the prospects for arms control in the near future are dim. Russia is wholly untrustworthy, and China is scornful. The Putin government, as a matter of policy, has systematically violated, either covertly or overtly, all of the arms control agreements it is bound by, save for one. And the Chinese government, believing that transparency and verification are signs of weakness, refuses to enter into arms control talks. So I repeat, there is no substitute for capable and adequate deterrent, which in the current and projected future environment requires an ability simultaneously to deter both Moscow and Beijing from attacking ourselves or our allies. Our current modernization program is absolutely necessary. I believe, however, that in the out years, it may likely require that the SSBN and air-breathing programs be augmented. And as Ambassador Edelman and I wrote in our written submission, I believe that a nuclear sea-launched cruise missile is important both for regional deterrence and for reassuring vital U.S. allies. I look forward to answering and expanding on any of these thoughts during your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank all the panelists for their excellent testimony. Ms. Gottemoeller, we know China is moving rapidly to become essentially a peer competitor in the nuclear arms race. How can we engage them? And I think, at least I believe, we should try to engage them and Russia in arms control talks and have perhaps an agreement, and what might be the starting point and what might be the end point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say that with regard to China, my colleague Frank Miller is quite right. Thus far, they have been difficult to engage. There's no question about it. I do find, however, that there is a considerable amount of work that has gone on behind the scenes in China, because I work quite a bit on so-called second-track activities where it is clear to me that they are studying the matter, so to say. The key thing is for them to get the political go code from Xi Jinping and from the top Chinese leadership. So I continue to believe that it is necessary to work very hard to engage them, and as I put it in my own remarks, to really understand what is behind that opaque curtain they have draped around their nuclear modernization. I know that they are modernizing. We can see that in their triad structures. And I know they are building up warheads. My argument, sir, is that we have some time to consider this matter. We will have strategic warning if the Chinese decide to sprint to parity. You mentioned yourself, as did Mr. Inhofe, that we expect to see China reach 1,000 warheads about 2030. More or perhaps less, but we don't expect to see them sprint to the level of the approximately 4,000 warheads that the United States has at the moment. So I think we have some time to watch and to try hard to work with them and to get them to recognize the value of negotiated restraint. So I think that that is the most important point I would say about China.
Ambassador Edelman, your comments on this issue?
Chairman Reed, I am somewhat skeptical about the willingness of the People's Republic of China to engage in this kind of discussion with us, and partly because, like my colleague, I broke my pick on this, in the Bush administration. When President George W. Bush met with Hu Jintao, they agreed that there should be a dialogue between the then 2nd Artillery Division and STRATCOM. And despite multiple efforts, including my own, we were never able to get there during the remaining 3 years of the Bush administration. I know that in the Obama administration, very serious efforts were undertaken by then Deputy Secretary Jim Steinberg to engage in this kind of discussion, all without without result, and there's certainly been no willingness publicly on the part of the Chinese to even entertain the notion of arms control, negotiations. In fact, they have held those out as something that goes on between the United States and Russia, but not something that they participate in. So, the best I think we can do is to work in the Track 2 domain, and I would note that in the history of the U.S.-Soviet arms competition, it took a very, very long time, more than a decade, really, of pugwash conferences and others to lay the groundwork before we got into serious arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union in the late 60s. So that would be the best case, in my view.
Well, but it's an area I think we must pursue in terms of the multiple approach towards the threat, not only having deterrence, but also talking about, and maybe it'll take 10 years, but those are probably 10 years of worthwhile investment. Ms. Creedon, you have experience at the National Nuclear Security Administration. You talked about some of their problems. How serious is the challenge that NNSA faces in terms of modernization, of keeping up with the effort?
Thank you, Senator. I think the problems with modernization actually exist across the board. So DOD has them, NNSA has them. With respect to NNSA specifically, the most significant problem at NNSA really is the infrastructure. A lot of it's very old. Almost all of it has either been replaced or is in the process of being replaced. It's a huge construction effort that's going on, and with a lot of delays. The second thing is really people. The complex is really struggling to attract, retain people, and get good people trained up. So it is significant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Miller, very quickly, my time is expiring. You have spent years studying the Soviet Union and Russia. Can you comment very briefly about the recent events and how it would affect arms control? Putin has made wild statements about using nuclear weapons, or other people have. Can just a quick sense of what you feel?
So I believe, Senator, that Putin understands that our retaliatory capability is adequate today to prevent him from attacking ourselves or our NATO allies. I think that we need to continue to modernize our force to be able to do that into the future. And if there is arms control in the future, somehow it needs to get a handle, as this committee and the Senate said back in 2010, to get our arms around their short-range nuclear weapons, which is the one he's threatening to use against Ukraine. But I think the key is to be able to maintain a credible deterrent against him and against Xi Jinping.
Thank you very much. Senator Inhofe, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe it's my age, but I enjoyed some of the reflections from the past that we shared this morning. And Ambassador Edelman, and when you said, when the Soviets build, when we build, the Soviets build. When we quit building, the Soviets build. How prophetic that was. Mr. Miller, numerous senior military officers have testified to their support for the continuing the sea-launched cruise missile program as a means of offsetting the growth in of Russia and China's nuclear arsenals. And I agree with this support. I'd ask you, first of all, do you believe that we should continue this program, and you should be able to continue other enhancements as well? Now, you offered in your opening statement to elaborate a little bit on this subject, and I'll give you that chance to do it now.
Thank you, Senator Inhofe. Yes, I agree that a nuclear sea-launched cruise missile is important, both to deter Russia and China, each of which have large tactical nuclear arsenals, and to reassure our allies who are faced by those specific tactical nuclear arsenals. So it is a program that I think is modest, but I think it makes a useful contribution. And I don't think it creates any sort of an arms race potential, because we're basically at very low levels there, and both Russia and China have much higher levels.
Yes, I agree with that. It's an excellent statement. This question would be for all witnesses. Considering what we know about China's nuclear breakout and Russia's large non-strategic nuclear weapons arsenal, do any of you believe that the United States should not continue modernizing its own forces? I'd like to have each one of you respond to that.
Senator Inhofe, I completely agree. The U.S. must continue its modernization programs of all three legs of the triad.
I too agree that the United States must continue its modernization programs at pace across the program of record.
Thank you.
Senator Inhofe, as I said in my opening oral remarks, I think it's imperative that we do so to sustain deterrence into the future.
Excellent.
Senator, I absolutely agree. And as I said in my remarks, I think in the out years, in the 2030s, we may need to augment that program by buying more SSBNs and more long-range standoff weapons. And I'm happy to elaborate on that at some point if you want.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the specifics touched by each one of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Inhofe. Senator Shaheen, please.
Well, thank you all for being here. Just to follow up on Senator Inhofe's question about the importance of modernizing in order to hopefully provide the deterrence that we need as we look at the capabilities of Russia and China. What do each of you consider to be the biggest threat to modernization? I'll ask you to begin, Ms. Creedon.
Probably two things. The first is money, and the second is a sustained commitment on the part of everybody, the administrations, this one, successive ones, as well as Congress, and also the commitment of the American people to truly be able to sustain a deterrent.
And do you believe that that commitment is there now?
I do. And it's been there for a couple years. I continue to think that at times it's more fragile than others. Right now, I think it's quite strong, but this is a very long-term program, and the handoff between the old and the new isn't really going to happen for another 10 years, and then we've got a very long period of time where it's a very difficult handoff.
Ms. Gottemoeller, do you have any difference in your thinking about what the biggest threat is to
Well,
modernization?
again, Senator Shaheen, I agree with my colleague, Madeleine Creedon, with regard to the long-term commitment of the U.S. public and also of our government from one administration to the next, very much so. And it comes down to ensuring a clear budgetary path, as I said, maintain our intense modernization at pace so we don't have dips and ups and downs and delays. But the other thing I would worry about, and I mentioned it in my remarks, is our industrial capacity. We have not had ability, I would say, to really turn out missiles and warheads now for many years in a steady pace, and so we need to rebuild our industrial capacity to be able to do so. And I support the efforts that are underway to improve our industrial facilities for both missiles and warheads.
Thank you. Do either of you have anything different than those responses?
Senator Sheen, I don't have anything different. I agree with what both Madeleine and Rose have said, but I would add that I think the education of the American public about these issues, which I think is extremely important since we really haven't talked about them very much as a nation, in all honesty, since 1992, since the end of the Cold War. And in that regard, I think I commend the committee on holding this hearing, because I think at least that helps begin, a process, but it's got to continue. We have to talk about this more to the public so that they appreciate what's at risk.
Mr. Miller?
Let me agree with my colleagues, but let me point out also that the industrial base includes the private sector. And I think that in the area of shipbuilding, submarine building, building missiles, we have lost a great deal of talent, and we need to worry about that, particularly about recruiting people through the STEM programs so that we have enough welders and enough engineers and enough designers to carry these programs through into the future.
Well, thank you. I think that's a very important point, and I would just argue before this committee that one of the things we need to do is to reauthorize the government programs that encourage innovation and encourage the private sector to do the things that we need, programs like the SBIR and STTR program. But I want to go back to you, Ms. Gottemoeller, as somebody who has spent a fair amount of time at NATO. Is there a role for NATO as we look at the nuclear deterrence, the need to try and bring China into some of these discussions? Do we think there's anything that NATO can do there to be helpful?
It's a very interesting question, Senator. I do believe that NATO can play a role here. First of all, NATO is very concerned about the necessity of getting constraints on non-strategic nuclear warheads and the missile systems that deliver them. Frank Miller pointed this out a few moments ago as this is the objective that has to be at the top of the priority list in our next arms control negotiations. The allies completely agree with that and are prepared to be supportive, in my view, including the kinds of cooperation with the United States that may be necessary to establish a monitoring and verification regime for such a treaty or agreement that would involve bases in Europe. I do believe that they are ready to work with us on that. Second, your question about China is very interesting because China and NATO have established some political military dialogue, and it is my understanding that, in fact, that dialogue has been rather rich and ongoing with regard to arms control topics. So perhaps there could be a role for NATO in that regard, also reaching out to China.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Senator. Let me recognize Senator Fisher, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would like to thank the panel for being here today, and to all of you, thank you for your very strong comments of support for nuclear modernization. And Ms. Creedon, I especially took note when you said we also have to factor in inflation when we look at what is needed in order to keep up on schedule with regards to nuclear modernization. So thank you for that. Also, in looking at a nuclear arms race and looking at the New START treaty and what's there, Mr. Miller, I liked your comments about Russia is not trustworthy and China is scornful. We all know that. None of us want to see an arms race, but I would say to you, I think we're seeing one. We're seeing it with our peer competitors, and that would be Russia and China. They are in a race with us in trying to outpace the capabilities that we have. So I also appreciated many of the comments that we've heard so far with regard to that, where we look at comments from members in the past, from Ash Carter, for example, who said in the last 25 years, we've only made modest investments in basic sustainment and operations, and we haven't built anything new in 25 years. And we are seeing tremendous advancements from the Russians and the Chinese with what they are building, what they are testing, and what they are capable of or will soon be capable of. Mr. Miller and Ambassador Edelman, I saw in your prepared statement you referred to China's test of a fractional orbital bombardment system as extremely destabilizing development, and you go on to describe a decapitation option that would also undermine many assumptions about deterrence and force governments to adopt very risky launch on warning postures, end quote. We've heard similar testimony to that from Admiral Richard, but I don't remember us ever digging into this at any of our hearings. So I kind of wanted to go off on that today and have you explain this problem that we're facing, give us a little more detail on that, and walk us through why you feel that this system would be so destabilizing. Ambassador, would you like to start?
Thank you, Senator Fisher. I'm happy to start and then let my colleague do cleanup in aisle 9. So the basis of deterrence, we discovered after long and hard efforts during the first 15, 20 years of the Cold War, was for each side to be able to have an assured second strike capability, a retaliatory capability that would allow it to ride out a first strike and then inflict unacceptable damage on its adversary. In order to do that, you have to have robust nuclear command and control. And the danger that the FOBS tests, I think, represents to us, the maximum danger, is that it could be, we don't really know why the Chinese did it, but it could be because of the path it takes, which evades our early warning systems, finishes, as Madeline pointed out, with a hypersonic glide vehicle. It could essentially be the basis of a no-warning attack on the National Command Authority.
It's a first strike use, and it's also a surprise attack where we wouldn't have that warning, correct?
Correct. And that's the danger in it, because the assumptions of stability are the ones that I articulated that we have to maintain. But if I've misstated anything, I know my colleague will correct me.
Eric didn't misstate anything. I mean, we faced short warning threats in the past from Soviet cruise missile submarines off our coast, and way back in the old days, Yankee-class ballistic missile submarines. But we would know about the launch of those weapons, and we would be able to track them. In this case, as Ambassador Edelman has said, we would not have that kind of warning if this system deorbited, and we wouldn't be able to tell where it was going. So everything that you've said and that Ambassador Edelman said is correct, Senator.
Do you believe that it is necessary for us to continue to look for other options that we could have in order to maintain a very strong deterrence, including being able to identify such surprise attacks so that we wouldn't see this decapitation happen to us, and that would then be off the table?
Yes, ma'am. I think we need to do that, and I think we need to continue to build a strong and robust nuclear command and control system. We have allowed that system to wither after the Cold War ended. The Department of Defense is now working to improve that, but that is an absolute priority. As Madeline Creedon indicated, that's often forgotten. We talk about the triad, but command and control is at the heart of all of that.
I don't forget it. NC3 is extremely important. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Kane, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your wonderful testimony and your service. I want to ask some intel questions to begin. Isn't it the case that our ability to deter is advanced significantly if we have the most comprehensive awareness of the nuclear capacities of our adversaries? Is that fair to say?
I would say that what we have to have is the most exquisite understanding of what the potential enemy leaderships value. We know about their weapon systems. The weapon systems are at the command of their national leaders. So we need to know what to hold at risk, which canonically has been the leadership itself, those structures that keep them in power, selected parts of their military forces, and the industrial potential to sustain war, so that they know if they aggress against us or our allies, the terrible things will happen to their ability to have a country.
And in addition to wanting to know that about our adversaries, if the goal is to deter nuclear war, it's also important to have good intel about other nations that are not adversaries. So, for example, India and Pakistan are nuclear nations. They're not adversaries, but if the goal is to deter nuclear war, having exquisite information about their plans and nuclear capabilities is important. And it's also important to have information about our allies, NATO allies, what their intentions are. This information is extremely valuable. It's extremely valuable. And it's very dangerous if it gets in the wrong hands. There's a prosecution going on right now in West Virginia of somebody who works over at the Navy Yard who was trying to pass U.S. nuclear secrets to a nation that's not an adversary, Brazil, as is publicly reported. seeking huge dollars for it. The federal judge in that case just threw out a plea agreement where the individual, Mr. Toby, would have been sentenced to 17 years in federal prison. The judge threw that out as insufficient. So obviously, information about U.S. nuclear capacity in the wrong hands is extremely valuable, and it's very dangerous if that information gets out. And I guess I'd like to explore the danger of information getting out that we have about not our own capabilities, but other nations. If having exquisite information about adversaries or allies or other nations is important to us to further a deterrence goal, if our information, for example, about adversaries' exquisite capabilities were to be released, I could imagine very significant dangers. I mean, adversaries would understand what we would know about them. They could change their plans. They could obscure what they are doing. They could make it more difficult for us to come up with the right modernization to deter them. Similarly, information we have about allies' nuclear capacity. If those were to get into the wrong hands, they could be used by other adversaries to target them. So I guess I want to ask you, given that having exquisite information about the nuclear capabilities of other nations and their intent and their thoughts about deterrence, given how important that is, you would agree with me that this kind of information, if it's held by the U.S. government, is highly, highly valuable, and we should do everything we can to make sure that it's not released to others without authorization, correct? Ms. Creedon?
Yes, sir, very much so. And I would also add there are other things that are of equal importance. So, for instance, cyber capabilities, space capabilities, all the things that underpin our deterrence and that we need to know about so that we can have a strong deterrent and also to be able to counter and protect against some of those things that are not openly known that others are doing.
Others who want to weigh in? Ms. Gottemoeller?
If I may briefly comment, Senator, it is a fine balance. I agree with you absolutely that information must be defended and without authorization must not be released. In certain circumstances, information can have a deterrent effect, of course. And I wanted to add to my answer to Senator Shaheen a moment ago that one of the things that has happened lately is the NATO allies have all moved forward on modernization of their dual-capable aircraft. Some, such as the Germans, we were not expecting them to move forward so smartly. So having them move forward and talk about it publicly is good for deterrence in Europe. So sometimes the information is valuable in that realm.
And usually, if that information is going to be shared, there would be a strategic discussion about the value of it being shared, not shared in a, I think, Ms. Creedon, you opened off and said it was a chaotic world these days. Information like that, if it's going to be shared, should be done so strategically and not in a one-off chaotic way, correct?
Absolutely, sir. And proper authorization from the government in charge of the information responsible for it is always necessary.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Rounds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, to all of you on the panel, thank you very much for taking the time to come in and to share with us your thoughts today. In the 2022 NDAA, Congress created a Strategic Posture Commission to review many of the important issues that we're discussing here. I know that 3 of you are members of the commission, with Ms. Creedon also chairing that group. Ms. Creedon, could you give us briefly an update on how the commission's work is going, and is there any assistance that this committee can provide to help assure the commission's success?
Well, thank you for that question, Senator Round. So clearly the Commission got off to a fairly slow start. We had a lot of logistical issues, but I would say the folks at Washington Headquarters Services and the Pentagon and others, and also staff of a number of the committees here were very helpful getting us around some of the initial ones, security and ethics sorts of things. The Pentagon also worked really quickly to get our FFRDC on board. We still have a lot of ongoing logistics issues that are continuing. I worry with those if we'll actually be able to make our due date or not. They're just difficult and they seem to be never-ending. On the other hand, the Commission has managed to meet 3 times, but we've had 1 classified session and 1 unclassified session, 1 virtual one. And so that's all been going pretty well. We have certainly had challenges. Mostly with the arrangement the department has put in place to screen briefings and documents in advance. So right now, all DoD documents and briefing material provided to the Commission must be reviewed by the Office of Policy to determine if they are releasable to the Commission. We've been told that as a legislative branch body, we are being treated as a congressional committee with respect to the information that DoD will provide. So we're very early in the process. The Deputy Secretary of Defense wrote a memo to all DoD components in early August, and she stated in her memo that DoD components are directed to provide full and timely cooperation with the Commission through the DoD liaison in fulfillment of the Commission's statutory duties and responsibilities as appropriate and consistent with applicable laws and regulations. So right now, at the moment, we haven't had a substantive issue, but as I've told DoD, I'm not optimistic, but I will certainly remain hopeful that the Commission receives what it needs to accomplish its statutory tasks.
Thank you. I think clearly there was a reason why we put emphasis on it in the 2022 NDAA. I simply draw attention to the fact that it is something that we all are looking forward to receiving. So, and we thank you for your work. I would offer this question, and I know that we're going to run out of time, but I'm going to try it anyway. It seems to me that we're really beating around the bush when we start talking about negotiating a New START treaty, unless we have China involved in this as well. I'm just going to ask the panel briefly, if I could, isn't it really futile to do a New START treaty unless we have all 3 of the major powers involved in actually agreeing to something? And right now, it doesn't appear that Mr. Putin has necessarily followed through with everything that you would normally consider to be acceptable behavior, particularly in Ukraine. So just briefly, what's the use of a New START treaty unless we get China involved in this as well?
Perhaps I'll start, Senator, if I may. I want to underscore that I do believe it's necessary to get China to the table, but the size of their strategic forces still remains well below that of the United States and the Russian Federation. We have, under the New START Treaty, 1,550 deployed warheads, we and the Russians, with additional warheads, approximately 3,000 each in addition. So our numbers are much higher, and so I think we can negotiate on the basis of equality. I think we need to strive to negotiate with the Chinese on the basis of equality also, and for that reason, I have been urging that we get into negotiations with them as soon as possible in areas where we have some equality of capability. That's what will bring them to the table. Intermediate range ground-launched missiles, for example, I think that's an excellent area to try to begin to actually constrain and reduce with regard to the Chinese. In the meantime, however, we cannot let their modernization go unanswered. We have to figure out what they're doing, and they have to really, I think, talk to us about it, because otherwise we must suspect the worst, as all of us around this room suspect the worst. So we need to understand what they are up to, and as I said in my statement, work with them to convince them of the value of negotiated restraint. Otherwise, we are going to have, I fear, an all-out arms race. And so I think that is a very concerning matter, but I think they are 2 separate things. There are negotiations to reduce and constrain where there is some equality of capability, and then there are some very direct, tough discussions about what they're up to.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but I would thank the panel for your work, and I will certainly appreciate your response. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Round. Senator King, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning we've used the word deterrence about 50 times. It's the bedrock of our strategy with dealing with nuclear weapons going back 70 years. Here's my concern. Terrorists with nuclear weapons. Deterrence depends upon the other side having a fear of death and a fear of destruction and a fear of the loss of their country and their infrastructure and their capital city. What about people who, A, don't care about dying, and B, have no capital city? While we were talking here this morning, I Googled building a nuclear weapon, and I even misspelled building, but still got dozens of responses on Google. How to build a nuclear bomb and other weapons of mass destruction, a book. YouTube, making a nuclear weapon, my personal favorite of YouTube. So you want to build a nuke. We need another theory or an adjunct to the theory of deterrence to deal with the threat of terrorists with nuclear weapons. We've got countries, Iran and North Korea, probably the most likely, with building with fissile material. Iran's a week or two away from from fissile material. How do we deal with this threat? Mr. Miller, your thoughts? It seems to me this is a whole new category that, frankly, I don't think we're addressing.
So, Senator King, I think I would have two groupings, or maybe three. Russia and China, classic deterrence. I think that a North Korea or an Iran would fall into the case of a classic deterrence situation because, as you say, there is a leadership, there are capital cities, there are valued assets. So
no, I'm talking about
I understand.
15 people in a tramp steamer
Yes,
headed
sir.
for New York Harbor.
I understand. And so the third category is terrorists, and I think that's outside the realm of nuclear deterrence. That's the realm of special operations forces. It's the realm of intelligence. It's the realm of conventional forces. It's the realm of prevention. It's the NPT. It's working with allies and like-minded states to prevent those people from getting the fissile material and from getting the weapons knowledge. Well, as you pointed out, you can get the weapons knowledge. But that's different than classic deterrence.
Oh, I agree. That's the problem. The theory of deterrence doesn't apply to this situation, which I think is one of the most serious likely threats.
We need to hunt those people.
I would suggest perhaps a Manhattan Project to figure out how to detect nuclear material from space or from a distance as our best defense, because deterrence won't work.
Yes, sir.
Others want to address this question? Madam Creedon?
Yes, sir, if I may. So for many, many years, the United States and Russia engaged in the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which made very substantial gains in securing the materials, the uranium, the plutonium, because at bottom, nobody can make a weapon without the materials, plutonium and uranium. So the focus on materials continues to this day. There's a very large program at NNSA. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency at DoD has them. DHS is focused on them, and it ranges from all sorts of detection capabilities to even interdiction capabilities.
Do you think it's adequate, or is this something that should be ramped up given the threat?
So I think it's quite good. What I worry more about is that it's not well understood, and like other things, I think there's this personal opinion. Of course, I also think there's a little bit of maybe a boredom, maybe a tiredness with the threat of nuclear terrorism. It hasn't happened. We always thought it was going to. It hasn't happened. So I worry that the fear of it, the threat of it, isn't taken seriously, and it has to be. So all of these programs.
The people that attacked us on September 11th killed 3,000 people. They would have killed 3 million if they could have. And I think this is something we have to take extremely seriously. Let me ask another question in a little bit of time left. It seems to me, Mr. Miller, that hypersonics changes the strategic balance altogether. And you suggested, I think it was you that was talking about the danger. You can have a nuclear weapon essentially dwelling in low Earth orbit over Washington. The analogy to the sword of Damocles is inescapable. Does this, it seems to me, we can talk about the technology of the command and control, but if the president, the vice president, and the leadership of Congress is gone, we're decapitated. There's no one to make the decision to launch, which undermines the deterrence because of the lack of a second strike, as you outlined. Should we have the vice president live somewhere else in the country? Should we disperse our leadership in some way? Because I think you raise a very important point. Without the threat of a second strike, of a retaliatory strike, deterrence doesn't work. And if part of that is command and control, and I don't mean technology, I mean people, maybe we ought to think about having the vice president live in Kansas City.
I won't speak for Kansas City, Senator. So I'll be very careful in answering your question because once upon a time I was involved in continuity of government programs. We need a survivable continuity of government to include nuclear command and control. Even a fractional orbital ballistic system would not come out of the clear blue sky. I mean, it would not come in a time of total peace. In a time of building tension,
What if the weapon is up there permanently? It's in low Earth orbit, just like Starlink, only it has a nuclear weapon that it can then dive. My calculation is it would take about 10 minutes to hit the Earth out of from 1,200 miles.
someone who owns it would need to make the decision to attack us. And
Correct.
presumably that would not come in a time of total peace. In a time of building tension, I think it is incumbent on the government to establish a survivable nuclear command and control system, which may include dispersing senior officials to more remote locations than Washington, D.C. I think the government has practiced that in the past. It can always be improved, but I think the point that you raise is particularly important.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Tuberville, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for being here today. Just follow up a little bit on Senator King here, the direction he was going. You know, we're operating on the assumption that we, meaning the president, has 30 minutes to respond to a nuclear attack. But with the advent of hypersonics, where do we stand with that today? Anybody want to answer?
Perhaps, Senator, I'll just add one remark, which is that ballistic missiles, ICBMs, are hypersonic. What is different today is the maneuverability in the end game. So that is what poses the... So in some ways, we're not facing a new threat because we have a hypersonic threat coming at us, but we are facing a new threat in the fact of this maneuverability. So I think that where the emphasis has to come is on resilience in our command and control system, particularly in our command and control system for the strategic nuclear forces. And Mr. Miller's already referred to that, but I really just wanted to underscore that message.
Thank you.
If I may just add one more thing, exercising this capability, which we don't do enough of.
Senator, I just would like to add one comment here, which is we had discussed earlier with Senator Fisher the fractional orbital bombardment system, which has a hypersonic glide vehicle on the end of it, which is the problem that you have with no notice attack. It's not just China. I mean, it was the Russians who first experimented with this in the 1960s and 70s. It was constrained by the original START treaty. The Russians have allegedly had abandoned it, but it was mentioned by President Putin in 2018 when he talked about other exotic nuclear capabilities. So it's not really clear whether the Russians have totally abandoned this idea or not. So it's not just something we need to worry about with regard to China. We also need to worry about it with regard to Russia, in my personal view.
If I could, Senator, and this is not the topic of this hearing, but you talked about hypersonics. I think we need to pay a lot more attention to conventionally armed hypersonics. The Russians and Chinese have conventionally armed hypersonics, which pose a terrific threat to our naval forces, to our surface forces at sea. We are on the cusp of deploying some hypersonic systems ourselves, which would be absolutely critical to taking down the the anti-access area denial defenses that the Navy's been complaining about for 15 years, but we are proceeding with deployment at a snail's pace. I mean, if our Navy is going to be able to operate in the South China Sea in a war or in the Baltics, we need to take down those anti-surface and anti-air defenses. And I think the committee in its own different work needs to look very much at those conventional hypersonic systems and to push the Pentagon to speed their deployment.
Thank you. Last couple of years, Admiral Richard has made his top unfunded priority the Sea Launch Missile. Hopefully we get that approved this year. Mr. Miller, could you talk about that a little bit more, about the importance of it?
I think, Senator, that we need something that our allies see is theater-based, that is around, that we can't keep saying, don't worry, we've got these systems in Omaha and in the States and deep at sea in the ballistic missile force, that we have something that we can show them and that we can show the Russian and Chinese leadership that we have capabilities that would match what they have and therefore that would deter them from using those theater and tactical nuclear systems.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, do you believe that pulling out of the JCPOA accelerated Iran's breakout timeline, or do you believe the Iranians plan to follow this pathway all along? Do you think they plan on doing it in any way?
I don't know what direction they're going in, but as others of your colleagues have said, that they are particularly close to having a nuclear weapon one way or another.
Thank you. It was good to hear people talk. Some of you talk about recruitment of STEM programs. I come from the educational field. We're struggling. Huntsville, Alabama is looking for engineers every day. We do a lot, obviously, with our defense, and we're doing a few things to help accelerate engineers. We've got to do that. We've got a majority of our kids in this country can't even read, much less do math or science. So hopefully we'll come up with some better programs to accelerate that and come up with more engineers in the future, because we're going to need them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Tocqueville. Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there is no question that we are confronting a challenging security environment. But the justifications we keep hearing for buying nuclear weapons sound like a drumbeat for a new Cold War, which strikes me as incredibly dangerous for the United States and for global security. One of the most common tactics used by boosters for more nuclear spending is to rattle off the number of weapons held by our adversaries and to cite projections of how China in particular could increase its stockpile of weapons in the coming years. Now, according to this so-called logic, anytime a foreign power is catching up to us numerically, we're supposed to shovel more money to defense contractors to get our own numbers up. Ms. Creedon, you have decades of experience working on nuclear weapons policy, and of course, the size of a country's nuclear stockpile is one key piece of information. But do you think the best or only way to measure U.S. power is counting our ability to match potential rivals warhead for warhead, launcher for launcher?
Thank you, Senator Warren. As you well know, this is a very complicated question, and it goes far beyond just who has 24 and who has 50. At a very basic level, substantial imbalances would be worrisome, but it's not just about nuclear weapons. It's about everything that we have. It's about the whole concept of integrated deterrence. And it's about the quality of our weapons across the board. It's about the quality of our people, the training of our people. And at the end of the day, we have guidance from a president as to what we hold at risk in a variety of different circumstances. And it's can we meet our own goals and objectives? Can we defend our country? And do our allies feel confident in what we have so that they're safe under the nuclear umbrella? So it's way more complicated than just numbers.
I appreciate that answer, and I'm concerned that focusing so much on the wrong measure may be good for defense contractors' bottom lines, but it is incredibly destabilizing. But there is an area where I think we actually should be doing more talking about the number of weapons we hold, not for the purposes of inviting an arms race, but to avoid strategic miscalculation. The Obama administration took an important first step in this regard when they declassified the size of our nuclear arsenal. Disclosing this information helps U.S. diplomats make the case to countries around the world that the U.S. is continuing its efforts to reduce nuclear arsenals, and it enhances our credibility in calling for other nuclear powers to be equally transparent. Ms. Creedon, when the Trump administration came in, they denied requests to declassify this same information. Do you think that the Trump administration's decision was helpful or harmful to nuclear deterrence and nonproliferation?
So, Senator, I am very supportive of the declassification of the broad numbers, the total stockpile. Rose and I were in the Obama administration together when many of these decisions were made, and so clearly we supported this. I think it is important for transparency. I think it has the potential to reduce some arms racing based out of unknowns, if you will. But on the other hand, people will do what they want to do. But I still think it's important for us to be transparent, because even though it wasn't reciprocated during the Obama administration, and this administration has done it one more time, I still think it's important. I mean, we do need to lead in these areas.
Yeah. We have to keep in mind that Russia and China don't trust us either. And when we hide this kind of information, we only add to their paranoia about our national security strategy. Thankfully, the Biden administration has reversed this harmful Trump administration approach, and it has started to put us back on the right path by declassifying the size of our nuclear stockpile. So let me ask you one more question, Ms. Creedon. Would it be helpful or harmful to continue the declassification of this information going forward?
So right this minute, Senator, I think it would continue to be helpful on an annual basis.
Good. Some are saying we should go back to the Trump era policy of keeping this information secret. I think that would be a mistake. When we keep this information classified, we give away our ability to pressure other nuclear powers to disclose information about their nuclear weapons. And I see it as, this may be a small step, but these are among the small steps that we need to take to rebuild our reputation with our allies and with our enemies. The Trump administration undermined our credibility significantly by withdrawing the United States from the Iran deal and from the INF Treaty. We need to continue to embrace arms control as part of our deterrence strategy. And I am very concerned that we are moving in the wrong direction when it comes to finding areas to collaborate on shared interests on nonproliferation. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Cotton, please.
Ambassador Edelman, sorry I wasn't here at the beginning, but I think I heard you reference a fairly well-known phrase about the Russians: when we build, they build. When we stop, they build. Did you use that phrase?
I quoted the late Harold Brown, Defense Secretary in the Carter administration, who famously made that a marginal note on a memo on the nuclear balance.
Yeah, good, thank you. I just want to make sure that we got for the record that was not Eric Edelman's statement, as insightful as you always are, but that was a statement from Jimmy Carter's Secretary of Defense. Mr. Ambassador, we heard a lot of talk today about a new Cold War, as we always do when the conversation turns towards nuclear weapons. I think I'm on safe ground saying you were around for the end of the Cold War.
Yes, sir, you're dating me. I was.
Could you just remind some of those who maybe weren't in office then, who won the Cold War?
I think the truth is we all won the Cold War, including the people of the Soviet Union, who had a very brief respite from totalitarianism, only to now have an authoritarian regime emerge in the last 20 years. But I would say that the conditions for the end of the Cold War were set by United States policy working with its allies.
Yeah, and can you mention specifically the role that nuclear weapons and more broadly military strength played in the free world winning the Cold War?
Well, I think we successfully deterred any major aggression by the Soviet Union, certainly against our treaty allies. And that, it seems to me, was a great achievement, and it was underpinned, by nuclear deterrence.
Yeah. Another thing we've heard a lot of talk about this morning, as we always do when we talk about nuclear weapons, is a dreaded arms race. Ambassador Edelman, can the United States avoid an arms race simply by not competing? Or is it a matter of whether we're going to win or lose an arms race if our adversaries are rapidly building up their arms?
As I said in my opening remarks, our adversaries have been building apace over the last 15 years, and we have been rather slow. I think all of the members of the panel here would agree that we have not been moving as quickly as we should to modernize our force. I think when it comes to the arms race issue, I think it's fair to say that we do not have to match everything that Russia does. There are things Russia is doing that I would not advocate that we match or do. For instance, we considered back in the bad old days of the Cold War a nuclear-powered cruise missile, and we abandoned the idea because it was too dangerous. If Russia wants to build a nuclear-powered cruise missile that spews nuclear radiation across northern Russia when it's tested, they can do that. We don't need to match it. But what we do need to do is make sure that we have the meet the fundamental requirements of deterrence, which, as Frank and I outlined in our opening statement, requires the ability to have an assured second strike capability. And I think all of us on the panel have said this morning that it ultimately requires the modernization of our existing triad.
Mr. Miller?
Senator, if I could make 4 quick points. I think, with respect, Senator Warren mischaracterized the entire situation. The concern about the Russian and Chinese buildup is the intent behind those leaders trying to build a large nuclear force, and why, and obviously it's one of intimidation. Second, there is no arms race. They have been modernizing their forces for the last 15 years. We're just starting to enter that game, and we are not talking about matching their numbers of warheads. What we're talking about is modernizing our aging systems, which, as Ash Carter made clear to this committee, if we don't modernize, those systems go away. So we either stay in the deterrent game by modernizing our forces, putting in new forces to replace old ones, or we get out of the game. And finally, to Eric's point, we don't need to have parity with the Russians. If they want to build more weapons to build make the rubble bounce, that's their problem. What we need to do is have sufficient warheads in our capacity to hold what they value at risk and to hold what the Chinese leadership values at risk. And in my judgment, 1550 does not allow us to do that.
No, I don't think it does. Your answers there bring back another nugget of wisdom for the ages, that we don't mistrust each other because we have all these weapons. We have all these weapons because we mistrust each other. And I would say that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have given the free world many reasons to distrust them for a very long time. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Kelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Edelman, Ukraine seems to be launching a rather effective counteroffensive against the invading Russian forces, and it appears that the tide might be turning, somewhat in their favor. We're going to have to see. News reports suggest that the Ukrainians' victory at Kharkiv in that region a couple of weeks ago resulted in the Russian military retreating and leaving behind a large amount of equipment, including tanks and howitzers and other artillery, as well as Russian troops just abandoning their posts. Certainly what we want to see. I think it's clear that this invasion is not going well for Putin. It's not going as he had hoped, and the question now is, how will he respond? Some are questioning whether he's capable of using a nuclear weapon, even a low-yield tactical weapon for psychological effect. Ambassador, under what conditions would you assess Russia would use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, and if so, what type and how?
Senator Kelly, that is a hypothetical question that requires a lot of speculation because we just don't know the answer, because the answer is inside Vladimir Putin's head. I think most likely we would see something, and this is something that Rose has written about, some kind of demonstration shot probably over the Black Sea. Russian doctrine talks about using these kinds of demonstrations of capability. Or possibly a very low-yield strike with a theater weapon, on some transportation hub of
So you're talking like half kiloton sized?
Might be a little larger than that, but it would. This gets into the question of what we call tactical nuclear weapons. Your description of whether it's tactical or strategic is equal to the square root of your distance from the weapon. So, I think it's a mistake to just, call these merely tactical weapons, given the impact that they could have on a place like Ukraine, even at very low yield.
Do you think it should affect our calculus going forward?
I think it has to affect our calculus. I think President Biden spoke to this the other night, and I think actually he spoke reasonably well to this question, which is to advise President Putin not to consider this as an option, and that the consequences would be incalculable.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ms. Creedon, as the chair of this committee's Emerging Threats and Capabilities panel, I've been focused on how technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing can make our weapons more effective. And earlier this year, I spoke with the National Nuclear Security Administrator, Jill Ruby, about how we could leverage emerging technologies to make our nuclear weapons safer. And I know that you have a lot of experience in the NNSA as well as in the Defense Department on this committee. So I would like to ask you kind of a related question. How are novel technologies like AI, unmanned systems, hypersonic, cyber, space-related systems changing the worldwide nuclear risk environment and potentially complicating deterrence?
Well, Senator, thank you for that question. I mean, obviously, this is one we could spend several days on. But from a deterrence and also from a safety and security perspective, things like AI, things like cyber certainly cut both ways. They can actually pose a threat, and they can also help the U.S. understand what's going on. So I will use one very small example here as a bit of a hypothetical, and it does relate back to Senator King's question, and it's like, are we still focused on threat reduction, and are we still focused on nonproliferation? Historically, one of our issues has been we haven't been able to address a proliferant or find until they've done something. One of the hopes of particularly AI is because of the machine learning, because of the management of the large data sets, we might be able early on to be able to detect where are anomalies, where is some entity, where is a country doing things that are not normal, that because of what they're doing or what they're buying, it may indicate that they're a nuclear weapons aspirant. So I think there are opportunities here. It's just a very new world.
Right. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Hawley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Ms. Gottemoeller, if I could start with you. You argued in your written testimony that Russia has a distinct advantage over the United States at present in terms of its ability to upload nuclear warheads and its ability to produce new warheads and missiles to carry them. And you write further, I'm going to quote you now, that the United States is not ready for a nuclear arms race and won't be ready until our new production facilities come online in the late 2020s or 2030s. Have I got that right? Is that an accurate statement? So let me just ask you about this. Are you worried, given all that, about China's upload and production capabilities relative to ours, given that Beijing is in the midst of a very pronounced nuclear buildup?
Sir, China's nuclear capabilities are in the course of being modernized. There's no question about it. But the Russians are master ICBM guys, and they have been for decades now, and they have been deploying heavy missiles that can carry a lot more warheads, such as the SS-18 missile. Now the Sarmat is being prepared for deployment. I'll just note, by the way, that both the Sarmat new heavy ICBM and the Avant-Garde hypersonic glide missile will fall under the central limits of the New START treaty, so they will have some constraints on them in that way. But I just want to note the mastery of upload, plus the large number of warheads that the Russians have. The Chinese certainly have that capability and that understanding of how to go about it. They just don't have the warheads that the Russians have.
Let me ask you this. You also say in your written testimony that the U.S. should not be the one to launch a nuclear arms race, but it must be ready to respond immediately to others who do. Is it fair to say that our ability to deter Russia or China from engaging in an arms race rests in part on our expanding our own nuclear forces?
Sir, I'm not sure we need to expand our nuclear forces, but we do need to modernize them, and we do need to put in place the industrial capacity to be able to build warheads and build missiles. And I really underscore this point that our industrial capacity has been allowed to lapse. And that goes, I agree with my colleagues who have spoken about the necessity of the expertise in addition to the missile facilities, the warhead facilities. We need the experts who are everything from the welders that Mr. Miller referred to up to the high-level engineers who help us to design and build our nuclear warheads.
Let me ask you about a follow-on to the New START treaty. Is your argument that a follow-on is in part a way to help delay further Russian expansion until we've restored our own production capability?
It gives us predictability, sir, about what the Russians are up to into the decade. I'm assuming that an agreement or treaty to follow New START would go into the 2030s, and our modernization is extending into the 2030s till almost 2040. To buy that kind of predictability into the next decade, in my view, is an important goal and in the national security interest of the United States.
Given that, I mean, just given the strategic balance there, what would Russia's interest be? I mean, why would we expect Russia to adhere to any such treaty, given their current, you might argue, strategic advantage in this area? I mean, why not just wait us out and then come to the table later with even more leverage?
Just as we are concerned about Russian capabilities to modernize, they are very concerned about our ability to modernize. They think of us as 10 feet tall. So I think we need to live up to that reputation, to be honest, sir, and get on with our own modernization. But that is the reason I think that they would come to the table. They want to make sure that we are not building up in a way that they cannot stomach. So that's the main point.
That's helpful. Thank you very much. Mr. Miller and Ambassador Edelman, if I could turn to you. You write in your joint statement that being able to absorb a first strike and retaliate against an aggressor while also holding in reserve sufficient forces to deter other near-peer competitors may in the future require larger numbers of deployed warheads than currently allowed under New START. Can you elaborate on that for me? Maybe both of you, either of you.
Yes, sir. So New START was done in 2010 when Russia was not a threat and China wasn't in the picture. Fast forward 12 years, Russia is a threat, China is a threat. The 1550 metric, in my judgment, does not apply to, say, a couple of years from now when we have to deter simultaneously Russia and China.
Ambassador, anything you'd like to add?
Yes, Senator. I think before you joined us, we talked a little bit earlier in the hearing about the requirement, fundamental requirement of deterrence is to be able to absorb a first strike and have sufficient forces in reserve to inflict unacceptable damage on the adversary. If you posit a Russian first strike and are riding it out, our retaliation under 1550, I think, would essentially leave us denuded of any, reserve to deter the PRC. And we also, as my colleague has pointed out earlier, we can't completely rule out at some point that Russia and China, given their limitless partnership, as Xi Jinping and President Putin have described it, working together against the United States. Right now, you see Xi distancing himself a little bit from the failures in Ukraine, but we don't know what will happen 5 or 10 years from now.
My time has expired, but this is a very, very important topic, and I want to ask you more about how we can increase our arsenal without getting into the kind of arms race that I was just talking about with Ms. Gottemoeller. So I'll give that to you for the record, and maybe a few other questions too. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Hirono, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panelists for a very enlightening discussion. So this is for the panel. During last Thursday's SASC hearing, my colleagues and I asked several questions related to the potential reestablishment of the Navy's Sea-Launched Cruise Missile Nuclear Program, SLCM-N. And I've expressed my concern regarding the necessity for restarting such a program and that the development of such a low-yield or tactical nuclear cruise missile could lead to a dangerous new kind of nuclear arms race. Given the importance of nonproliferation, are there other weapons or tactics that the U.S. can use to accomplish the same strategic objectives as SLICM without creating new nuclear weapons? Anybody on the panel care to respond?
I can start, Senator. With respect to a new nuclear arms race, we're talking about Russia, which has dozens of new tactical nuclear systems. The same is true of China. The United States has some air-delivered bombs in Europe, period, full stop. The development of a limited number of sea-launched nuclear cruise missiles would not contribute to an arms race. It would serve as a modest offset to Russian and Chinese systems already deployed. And I think that would serve as an enhanced deterrent and as a reassurance to our allies in Europe and in Asia, many of whom have called on us to deploy such a system.
Senator,
Anybody else on the panel? Yes.
If I may, I'd like to comment briefly. I actually disagree with my distinguished colleague on this one. I do think that our air-launched cruise missiles, which we are modernizing in a very intensive way, and I expect to see that to be a very significant capability, provide that kind of flexible forward deterrent capability if we need it. So I do not see the need for a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. I do believe in the role of conventionally armed sea-launched cruise missiles. They are really a foundational capability for the U.S. Navy. I also think that when we think about this question, we need to take into account the operational challenges that the Navy faces in certifying its ships and submarines for nuclear carriage, and how difficult it can be to sustain ops tempo when these nuclear capabilities have to be taken into account. And that's, I'm not a naval man, obviously, or a naval woman. It's something I think that the Navy is competent to comment on. But that is my impression, that there is a certain heavy lift that has to be done to redeploy nuclear weapons of this class on naval platforms.
In that, I think you are, not I think, I know you are in agreement with Secretary Austin. Now, all of you have noted that it is really important for us to modernize our nuclear triad. So do you believe that the U.S. should prioritize modernizing the nuclear triad over expanding its nuclear arsenal with a program such as SLICM?
So I'll be happy to jump in on that one. So right now, clearly the most important thing is the modernization of the program of record, which does not include the SLICM-N. That said, there are other issues associated with the SLICM-N that certainly need to be addressed. So operational issues with that, how it would be used in a deterrence value, how our allies would see it. But the other thing is a more practical thing, and that's really with the industrial base. So the warhead for the SLICM-N would be the exact same warhead that's now being modernized for the new cruise missile. And there's only so much capacity for warhead production at NNSA. And so if you were going to extend the production run for the 80-4, which is the warhead, to make more, then you have to ask yourself, well, what else are you giving up in the context of our overall arsenal? So, there's a lot that needs to be understood with respect to this before there is a decision to really build and field this.
So I think it's important to understand that SLICM-N, if it exists, is in the out years. Clearly, building the triad systems now is the priority, and Ms. Creedon has talked about the warhead issues. But in fact, from the early 1980s until the end of the Cold War, we deployed nuclear-armed cruise missiles on our submarines and for some period of time on our surface ships, and the Navy was perfectly capable of doing that. So the Navy could, if it was in the national interest, do that again. That decision, again, remains in the out years.
Thank you for that clarification. I just want to mention, Mr. Chairman, that I really appreciate the fact that our panelists have said that the nuclear arms discussion is not just about parity, that it is basically a whole of government approach that we need to employ, and that this requires very strong diplomatic efforts as we and intel efforts as we try to determine what is actually going to deter China, North Korea, or Russia. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of our witnesses here today for an interesting conversation. I want to talk a little bit about cybersecurity, which has been raised. Ambassador Edelman, in your joint statement with Mr. Miller, you discussed the potential of cyber attacks to disrupt our second strike retaliatory capability by interfering with nuclear command and control. This obviously adds a whole new dimension to the concept of deterrence and warfare generally. If you could talk a little bit about that, and specifically, do you believe that cyber warfare will also impact initial launch sequences and potential vulnerabilities that our adversaries would have?
Senator Peters, I think, thank you for the question. I mean, there are a lot of unknowns about how cyber warfare will interact with, nuclear weapon systems. But one of the reasons why I'm such a strong advocate of modernizing the ICBM leg of our triad with the new Sentinel ICBM is that when we built the Minuteman III in the late 60s, it was in the pre-internet age. And so to be able to have confidence that we have a system that is, not only fit in a cyber environment, that we can preserve our command and control of it, but also electronic warfare and other things, we need to go ahead and modernize. I'm not an expert on cyber, so I don't want to, pretend that I know that much about how it might interact, but obviously we have to be very vigilant about that aspect because, again, going back to earlier discussion, nuclear command and control is absolutely essential to underpin deterrence.
Well, as we talk about that, and Dr. or Ms. Creedon, I think you answered a question with one of my colleagues related to artificial intelligence and the new systems that go forward. The one thing we know about the future of warfare is the speed of decision-making will continue to advance rapidly, particularly when you get autonomous weapons systems that will be flying and may make kill decisions by taking a human out of the loop because speed will be the difference between staying alive and dying. What happens as we see the integration of AI systems, not just in our systems, but in systems that the Russians or North Koreans or other will put into effect? It seems to me that opens up the opportunity for a catastrophic miscalculation that may be hard to unwind. What are your thoughts, Ms. Creedon, on that?
Well, I certainly agree with that. And just as a very fundamental philosophy, I would certainly hope that AI was, in terms of autonomous warheads, autonomous weapon systems, was never applied to nuclear. Because I think it's absolutely essential that there remain people in that loop for nuclear. If I could, though, I also would like to point out something different, and that's really the internal cyber thing that we have to worry about, and that's in the context of our industrial base and new warheads. That making sure that as we build our own systems, that they are sufficiently robust from attacks, and that we are sufficiently cognizant of all of the electronics that go into these so that we know their pedigree and that we're not setting up our vulnerabilities for future cyber attack.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
Just a quick comment, Senator Peters. I agree with what Ms. Creedon had to say about never having the absence of a man in the loop for nuclear decision-making. This is an area that I think is very important to pursue in discussions with the Russians and the Chinese. We need some normative standards set here. Of course, it's something you can never monitor and verify in the way you can an arms control treaty, but just having them agree with us that this is an area that should be immune to attack, I think is very important.
Well, I appreciate that, and I agree. And it should probably be a part of an arms treaty. Obviously, verifying that may be very difficult, but there's certainly a big movement to figure out how we deal with lethal autonomous weapons, because we know that other countries may not be constrained by some of the ethical constraints that we place. But at some point, if they go that distance, we'll be under a lot of pressure to make sure that we can respond. Otherwise, we put our men and women at great risk to a system that can operate in a nanosecond. So to what extent should that be part of nuclear treaties that we think about this? Because clearly this is coming. This is not if, this is when.
I think going forward, we should be looking to many different instruments, treaties and agreements constraining nuclear weapons, but also agreements with regard to normative principles of this kind. But it probably doesn't need to be in the same document, but we need to have a set of documents that, and one of them must clearly address this kind of issue.
Right. Thank you. Oh, yes.
Oh,
Ms.
I
Creedon.
just want to add something, because earlier we had a discussion about where is the future of arms control and whether we need, one very large treaty or more new bilateral treaties. This is one I think that really does lend itself to a much larger bilateral international agreement that countries could agree that this is not, in other words, nuclear AI, nuclear autonomous vehicles, is not somewhere to pursue, somewhere to go.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Senator Peters. Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our panel, many of whom I've gotten to know well over the years, served with some. And Dr. Gottemoeller, nice to see you again after our Aspen meeting. I want to continue this discussion on the China breakout, but I want to ask the question in the context. I've been focusing a lot on the implications of a war in the Taiwan Strait. One thing I think that a lot of people are missing, but I'd like your review on it, or your views on it, is this breakout, I think, is actually very related to Taiwan, meaning if the Chinese are going to look to possibly invade Taiwan at the end of this decade or earlier, they're going to want to have some kind of nuclear deterrent posture with us. So I think it's actually driven by that. But what do you think? And maybe we'll start with you, Mr. Miller, and just go down the line quickly. The breakout hasn't been discussed in the context of an invasion of Taiwan, and I think it's directly related.
I believe it is directly related, but I think that today China already has the capability to destroy our population base, our cities. The question is, where is Chinese strategy going in the future? Are they seeking to have some sort of a counterforce capability in that overall deterrent threat against us intervening in Taiwan? But I think that is the driver. I think you're absolutely correct. And there's a bit of they're needing to have force to deter Russia as well, because there's a rivalry there.
Ambassador?
Senator Sullivan, I agree with you, and this is something that Frank and I addressed in our formal statement submitted to the committee. The attention in the Chinese buildup has gone largely to the strategic and particularly the FOBs, which we had a discussion of earlier, but there's also a buildup of tactical forces opposite Taiwan. And I think we have to pay attention both to the strategic balance, globally, but also the theater balance, in part because I think the Chinese are trying to do what the Soviets did in the Cold War, which is put stress on the reliability of our extended deterrent guarantees and intimidate our allies and intimidate us with essentially an effort to make sure we don't exercise a counter-intervention capability if they try and invade Taiwan.
Let me follow up with a question again for the whole panel, and if the two who didn't get to answer, my first question, want to take it in order, but because it's a follow-up, Ambassador, to your question. I was kind of dismayed to see that President Biden is like President Obama was at the end of his tenure, is toying with this no first use idea. Biden's nuclear review omits no first use, but it seems like they're still toying with this idea. What do you think that does as it relates to our allies, particularly our allies in Asia, related to your point, with regard to not just Taiwan, but an administration that once again is toying with this concept. And can I get each of yours definitive answer? Can just be one sentence on whether you agree with the a no first use doctrine, or you think it would undermine deterrence and our allies. So, Ms. Gottemoeller, can I start with you, Dr. Gottemoeller?
Yes, certainly, Senator. Good to see you again
Yeah, nice
after
to
our
see you.
meeting in Aspen. By the way, I'm not a doctor, so you can just say Ms. Gottemoeller
Well,
or just
I
Rose.
You never go wrong if you call someone doctor or ambassador. I found out in this job. But.
Well, thank you very much. I would just underscore what you had to say about what is evidently in the nuclear posture review of the Biden administration. It hasn't been publicly released yet, but the fact sheet we have out of the DOD clearly does not refer to any kind of no first use policy.
Okay, so you're against that? You would be against that?
What I agree with is the notion that's in that fact sheet that says the possibilities of nuclear use are extremely remote, and I absolutely agree with that. As far as what was put down in the posture review, it looks like it doesn't touch the no first use issue.
Ms. Creedon?
So, Senator, I certainly agree that the conditions are not appropriate for a no first use policy. Ironically, this was something that the Obama administration wrestled with at the end and determined that the conditions weren't there then, and the conditions now are even worse.
It just keeps popping up, though, I mean, as you know. Ambassador, Mr. Miller, I just want to, and any other comments on allies, Taiwan, or?
Just a brief one. This is something Frank and I have actually written about in the past. I don't see the value of a no first use pledge. I don't think our adversaries would take it seriously to begin with. I don't think it really buys us anything, but it would be, I think, discomforting to our allies and undermine extended deterrence.
So I used to joke that Woody Hayes said that a forward pass would have 3 things happen, 2 of which were bad. A no first use policy has 4 things that would happen, and they're all bad. 1, our allies would be disheartened because they would believe the nuclear umbrella is shrinking. 2, those allies who are capable of building their own nuclear weapons will take a step closer to building their own nuclear weapons because they won't believe in us. 3, the Russians and Chinese will never believe that we have adopted that policy. And 4, the Russians and Chinese will not change their own first-use policies based on a U.S. no first-use pledge. So I think it's a terrible idea, and I've opposed it all along.
Excellent answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great panel here.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Rosen, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reed. It's really a great hearing. I want to thank all of our witnesses for their expertise, your service, and for being here today. But I'm going to talk a little bit about, of course, some things in Nevada, because Nevada National Security Site, of course, right in our backyard. So, Ms. Creedon, the remote sensing laboratory, both at Nellis Air Force Base and Joint Base Andrews, provides radiological emergency response teams along the West and the East Coast, respectively, who stand ready to deploy anywhere in the world. These personnel and those of the Nevada National Security Site are the nation's experts in detecting, locating dirty bombs, loose nukes, sources of radiation, and determining the origin and attribution through nuclear forensics. I was recently speaking with NNSA about the remote sensing laboratory and the radiological sensors we have provided Ukraine as Russia has seized control of several Ukrainian nuclear power plants as part of its invasion and, of course, we know continues to threaten them. So, Ms. Creedon, from your time at NNSA and DOD, can you speak to the interagency and multinational effort that is occurring to prevent a nuclear disaster from happening in Ukraine?
Thank you, Senator. As you've noted, the remote sensing lab is an incredibly capable lab. It's a very small lab as these things go, but it's a very capable lab. But it works also in a much larger system of laboratories at the Department of Energy and the NNSA, as well as with cooperation from the State Department and DOD to put together and develop, do the research, do the deployment, do the acquisition of a whole suite of sensors for radiation detection on the ground, on personnel. We have radiation detectors in space, but it's essential that we understand what's going on there from a public health perspective. If the Russians, as Rose mentioned earlier, do something really awful at these two sites, including the second one that they've now shot at.
Thank you. I want to continue on this. So, Ms. Creedon, the United States must deter two nuclear-capable competitors for the first time in history, a fact which is widely discussed, including here today, of course. So, Ms. Creedon, how does having to defend against multiple nuclear-capable competitors affect the nation's strategic requirements, and should we reorient our posture as a result? And when you look at the range of diverse and increasing nuclear risks potentially around the globe, how should we be prioritizing these threats? Which ones are most concerning to you?
Well, certainly taken together, Russia and China, particularly on the trajectory that they are both on with respect to their nuclear systems, the variety of their nuclear systems, and the number of their potential systems do present a threat to the U.S. But my first priority for the U.S. is to make sure that the current modernization program is continued on pace, on track, that it's funded and that it's supported. And the second thing is that the systems that we have now, which are very old, that they be sustained, because my assumption is that some of the new ones could very well be late, and sustaining these old ones is absolutely essential. But I also think we need to look broader. So our deterrence is more than our nuclear deterrent, even though our nuclear deterrent is at the heart of it. So we do have to look broader to look at how does the U.S. present a full deterrence picture to all of our adversaries, at the same time assuring our allies that we are, in fact, committed to them and protecting them, and that we have the capability to deter. So it's way more than just the nuclear part of it.
Thank you. Ambassador Edelman, same question to you. How should we be prioritizing these multiple threats, in your opinion?
Well, I think we have to prioritize first the threat that remains the only existential threat to us today, which is Russia. But China is moving apace, and so, as my colleague, Mr. Miller, said, I think we have to rethink what might be required to hold both at risk simultaneously. And we do have lesser included cases that have been mentioned during the course of this hearing, including North Korea and Iran, as well as the terrorist threat that Senator King mentioned. And I would add on that point, it does seem to me that we need to think about, because nuclear weapons, while, as Senator King pointed out, you can look up pretty easily on the internet how to build a nuclear weapon in theory, we are lucky that it's actually not that easy as an engineering feat to do. So the most likely path for terrorists to get their hands on nuclear weapons is to get them from a state actor that has them. And I think in that regard, North Korea is a particularly worrisome threat, but Pakistan is as well. And in fact, if I had to pick one place where I would most be worried about, it would be Pakistan, and it's one reason why I, for one, am very sorry that we no longer have a presence in Afghanistan, because to me that is the most likely route, loss of control of nuclear weapons in Pakistan, that terrorists get their hands on one.
Thank you. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to be submitting some questions for the record based on the discussion here today. What legs for Ms. Creedon of the triad do we recommend that we focus our investments on? And, of course, building on Senator Peters' cybersecurity question. So thank you.
I thank you, Senator Rose. And Senator King has requested an additional question. Senator King, please.
Ambassador Edelman, what is our doctrine with regard to response to use of a tactical nuclear weapon? The President made a statement to Mr. Putin. Is that it, or is there a doctrine? What is our deterrent strategy for the use of a low-yield nuclear weapon, either as a demonstration in the middle of the Arctic Ocean or in terms of a strike on a city in Ukraine?
Senator, I think our deterrent posture has always been based on the notion of calculated ambiguity, that we would determine at the time of use how we would respond to a weapon and a use of a weapon. And I think that remains very useful today. I think this goes back to some of the foundational thinking about deterrence in the Cold War, and in particular the work of Thomas Schelling, who famously in Strategy of Conflict wrote in 1960 that the risk that leaves something to chance in the mind of your adversary, the notion that if they do this, they're moving down a road the consequences of which they cannot calculate, is perhaps the strongest deterrent that we have. And in that regard, I thought the President's statement to Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes on Sunday was exemplary.
Thank you. Mr. Miller?
So, Senator, I think it's a great question, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the President of the United States. All of our jobs, and I've devised war plans, I've helped make sure that they were implemented correctly, is to provide the President options, period, full stop, whoever the President is. And when Mr. Sullivan and I, Senator Sullivan and I work together, that you provide the President options and you don't box a President in as to what option he's going to take. So there is no open and shut, black and white answer to your question. The President at the time, if an adversary, enemy, used a nuclear weapon, would decide what to do, whether it was a short-range weapon, a medium-range weapon, or a long-range weapon.
And I love your comment, Mr. Ambassador, that your determination of what's tactical depends upon the square root of your distance from the explosion. I think that's a very astute observation. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the panel. Really fascinating hearing and great insights.
Well, thank you very much, Senator King. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for extraordinarily informative discussion. The purpose was to reinvigorate and re-engage individuals in a serious discussion of the new nuclear challenges we face, which are different than the Cold War, but they're just as potentially consequential. And you've applied some incredibly important insights to this discussion. This is the beginning, not the end. We have to keep this topic, as some have suggested, on the front page and seriously think about what's similar to the Cold War and what's very much different. One issue that's come through very clearly, though, is the need for modernization of our triad together with our industrial base, and I concur entirely with that. I think also, too, there was discussion about arms control is something that is a very difficult process, but something that should be pursued. As I think Ambassador Edelman pointed out, it took 10 years of around the table before the Russians decided that it was in their interest to settle it. It might take that long with the Chinese, but I think we have to continue to do that. With that, let me thank you all for excellent testimony and adjourn the hearing.